Well, thank you all for coming. My pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Erika Dyck. Erika got her BA from Dalhousie, so I haven't talked to her about that, but I did a postdoc at Dalhousie. Probably know some of the same people, although you were in history. So she went back to Saskatoon to do her MA, and then she did her PhD here at McMaster and graduated in 2005. Her thesis was on psychedelic psychiatry, specifically looking at the clinical trials that happened in the 60s. She's a historian, so she writes books. She also writes articles, but she does write books. So this is a book that came out a number of years ago, and this is, I guess, just based on your thesis, right? Yeah. So psychedelic psychiatry, LSD from clinic to campus. So some of the things about how psychedelics emerged on campus. This is the book, this is a graphic novel that is about Erika's history. She didn't write this, but she has a wonderful afterword. And we're going to talk about this in the Psychedelic Journal Club tonight. And then she just showed me her latest book, which isn't out in press. This is a preprint of the book. It's called Psychedelics, A Visual Odyssey. And it's basically what it says. It's a picture book of all the famous psychedelic images from across the ages. So I met Erika, I guess, 2 years ago. Actually, before I met her, we applied for a grant with my grad student, Rotem. We didn't get the grant, unfortunately, but we did get a chance to meet at the International Conference for Psychedelic Research in Harlem, which was a great time. Erika gave a great talk, and I imagine she's going to show us some amazing pictures and give a wonderful talk, so everybody give her a warm welcome.
Thank you, David. Is this on? Everybody can hear? And I forgot that I actually have a little gift for David that is going to be part of the presentation. Here we go. So as you are going to learn, if you don't already know this, Saskatchewan is where the word psychedelic was coined. And I found an artist who makes really groovy psychedelic fridge magnets in the shape of our province. So thank you. Oh, cool. You are now part of the Saskatchewan Psychedelic Club. Awesome. Well, it's really a true pleasure to be here. This is my first time back at McMaster since graduating in 2005. I've actually visited the campus. I played soccer here a few times, but I haven't been here to give a talk. So this is really exciting. And some of the work that I'm going to share with you is actually part of that early inspiration that happened just across the park here at Chester Newhall, where I was doing my PhD in history, and where some of my committee members kind of giggled and laughed and thought, you know, psychedelics. I mean, you're never going to get a job if you do a history of psychedelics. No one's going to take you seriously. So I see that none of them are here now, but you know, please live stream this to the history department. Just kidding. It is interesting to see that the conversation about psychedelics since I did that work beginning in the early 2000s has really changed. I don't think there was a psychedelic student club. I'm pretty sure there wasn't. And like I said, there were only a few people who were even willing to sort of quietly in dark corners talk to me about bona fide psychedelic research that had occurred decades earlier in the 1950s, the 1960s. And I was telling David at lunch that I believe there was one, I think he was a member of the psychology department, but like was very quiet about it. Didn't want anyone else to know that he had been part of psychedelic studies in the past. The reputation of them had, of course, changed so dramatically that it was even difficult to talk about legitimate historical trials. See if I can, that's not, there we go. I have nothing to, I have many things to disclose, but nothing that should concern the administrators here. So I want to just sort of dive into some of the historical points, but also how I think looking at the history of psychedelics might help us to think about the future of psychedelics, or how we might use history to imagine different sustainable ways that we can bring psychedelics into our world in, like I said, sustainable, harm reduction ways. So I want to start with the word itself. And some people have said to me, like, psychedelics kind of old, we should probably move on and come up with a new term that doesn't have the kind of stigma or baggage of psychedelics from the 1950s and 60s. And I'm going to try to convince you that I disagree. Or I don't have to convince you. I disagree, and I'm going to try to convince you to agree with me. So here's, the only really super history nerd moment, the, actual scan of the actual letter where the word psychedelic is first written. And you may know this story, and it's depicted in that graphic novel, but there was a psychiatrist, Humphrey Osmond, who was trained in Britain and moved to Saskatchewan under the Tommy Douglas reforms in 1951. And he came there and he became friends with Aldous Huxley, and the two of them were writing letters back and forth to each other as they tried to capture a word that would give its own space, its own kind of intellectual space or consciousness to the theories even, to how we understand these sensations that one feels when they take something like mescaline or LSD or psilocybin. And those were the three they had by then tried. So you can see in the blue ink that Aldous Huxley had written after he'd typed out, his wife typed out the letter, his eyes were failing, she typed for him. To make this trivial world sublime, take 1/2 gram of phenerethyme. And I doubt that anybody here has a phenerethyme club, but Phaneros in Brazil is going strong. They have decided to take phenerethyme and reinvest in that word. But in the red ink below, you can see, and this is in Humphrey Osmond's script, this is a psychiatrist, to plumb the depths or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic. And if you continue to read the correspondence that unfolded over the next, well, they were friends for the next 10 years until Huxley's death, they really thought that this word deserved its own space, that it wasn't necessarily something that made you think psychoanalysis, psychodynamics, psychopharmacology, even psychiatry or psychology, that this was a word that had its own sort of disciplinary space, or could bring different disciplines together in a study of consciousness or non-ordinary states of consciousness. And I'm going to suggest that it's a good word to use, and I think we can use some of that diversity going forward. You may know that The Doors of Perception was published. He wrote it in about a month after his first mescaline experience, that is Aldous Huxley, a mescaline that he had received from the British psychiatrist working in Canada, Humphrey Osmond. And here's a nice little snapshot that Osmond took of, this British author in tweed, obviously having his first mescaline trip. I think he always tripped in tweed, by the way. These are super not hippies. And you can see it says, here he is with his mescalinized eyes. And it's this nice kind of entry point into what these two men, this philosopher and dystopian writer, and this psychiatrist, and someone really interested in psychopharmacology, how these two minds came together to carve out some space for this study, and some of the people that joined them along the way. Of course, these guys didn't sort of invent this field or this idea. They maybe codified it and gave it some vocabulary, but there are lots of others who have been investing in different ways of understanding consciousness and non-ordinary states of consciousness, and the relationship between, of course, plants and consciousness. We see this in, of course, in indigenous studies of sacred plants. Ethnobotanists came up with their own term in the 1970s or 1979, entheogens, drawing really on the spiritual elements, but also that relationship between plants and consciousness. Parapsychologists had been playing with some of these ideas as well. And of course, we'll get to Leary in a moment. But there are a number of different ways that people have been investing in these kinds of ideas or theories, and also, I'll suggest, moving that conversation into particular disciplines for, as we try to understand who are the experts of psychedelia. More recently, I sort of flippantly put out a tweet a few years ago. It was like, could somebody write a history without Timothy Leary? And because I did that cheekily, then I decided I better respond to the people who are responding to me. And so we wrote a book about the global conversations about, or conversations about psychedelics that took place in other parts of the globe. And what became evident, often by working with translators, is that there are a variety of different kinds of psychedelic stories. And here I'll use psychedelics a bit anachronistically. There are different stories that unfold in different parts of the world that involve these common substances, LSD, psilocybin, maybe ibogaine. And there are a variety of different ways that those regions, those places, those communities brought together either scientific ideas about how to study these substances or cultural expressions of what psychedelics did to amplify certain countercultural goals, musical goals, even a lot of artwork. And you can see one of my favorites here is the sort of figure floating over a blue sky. And And this is a mescaline fairy tale written by a Guatemalan, illustrated by a Guatemalan indigenous woman and written by her German partner. Now it's a rare book that costs like $300 on eBay. Psychedelics inspire different kinds of cultural expressions around the world in ways that go far beyond San Francisco or Greenwich Village in New York, or, I know we're in Hamilton, so I'm allowed to say this, like, Toronto, right? I lived in Toronto, it's okay, it's nice. But there are places outside of North America that also had these kinds of countercultural expressions, some of which dovetailed with locations that also had concentrations or constellations of medical research, and others that really took their cues from other parts of a psychedelic movement, like the hippie trail, for example, as people hitchhiked and moved their way through, as they became very fascinated by the kind of Eastern expression, particularly as Americans left the United States in search for something more authentic. So I want to do like just a quick overview of, well, I talk too much. It might not be quick. I'm going to do an overview of psychedelic science as I've been trying to understand it as a historian, and then use that as a jumping off point to think about what lessons we might take, what steps we might avoid as we think through the future of psychedelic science. And I gather that many of you are familiar with this story, so nod along, or I'll speed up, or give me quizzical looks and I'll slow down. But what I want to talk about here is the kind of diversity of psychedelic science that was unfolding beginning in the 1950s. Rotem has seen these, David has seen these, but maybe, hopefully, most of you have not. One of the projects that we started working on was trying to get an idea of where psychedelic research was being published around the world throughout time. And so we went to the internet and we decided to use digital resources to try to identify and then map out the flow of information about psychedelic studies. And what we found, and I think the maps are really quite interesting, but what we found is that the sort of above ground published studies about psychedelics are rather limited. So they tell us one part of the story, but there's a whole other part or many parts of psychedelic history that never made their way to the archives, never made their way to published records, and sometimes only exist in fragments of memory and coded in different ways that people would share this information with one another so as to avoid detection. None of that is really captured if you do the Google searches, or certainly if you go to the library. But that's a really big and rich part of this story, and I'm going to try to give you a few examples of that as I move through. So I see the history of psychedelics as being part, this is my job as a historian, like, don't look at psychedelics, what's happening widely, what's the context here? And one of the contextual pieces I think is really important is the way in which classification systems, whether we think about plants and botany, or classification systems when we think about psychiatric disorders, are really ramping up throughout the 20th century. And alongside that is this desire to isolate chemicals or alkaloids from plants in an effort to harness their powers, instrumentalize them, even often commercialize them, and scale them up for pharmaceutical use in some cases, but also for other industrial purposes. You can think about rubber as an example. We see with psychedelics, there's just a few examples here of a kind of litany of efforts or focal points where we're trying to sort of understand the relationship between these plant substances and the psychoactive effects. And of course, a growing effort to remove the plant as the source of that power, to think about how we can scale up the production, for example, of psilocybin once synthesized. So of course, that story really revolves around, and much of the history that's been written has revolved around this man, Albert Hofmann, who was a Swiss biochemist working at Sandoz Pharmaceutical Laboratories in Basel, Switzerland. In 1938, his boss, Arthur Stoll, asked him to investigate ergotamine. And I don't know if anybody here knows about ergot. Okay, good nods. So it's a fungus that grows on rye. It changes your blood circulation if your cattle eat it, if you all have cattle. But if you are growing rye for cattle feed, which mostly it was being grown for, the cattle have all sorts of gangrenous effects. Their milk supplies dry up or are quite blocked and ruined. And right now, actually, the Canadian government is in trouble because some of our wheat and rye has too much ergot in it, and they're not able to sell it. So this has been a real problem for agricultural historians for a long time. But Stoll recognized that midwives since at least the Middle Ages, had been using ergot products to control births, to bring about contractions, to change blood circulation for other purposes, for perhaps positive purposes. So he wanted Sandoz to invest in ergot research, and Hoffman set about to do so. And in 1938, he synthesized an ergotamine product, and he called it D-lysergic acid diethamide 25. And it sat on a shelf. And the animal experiments with it didn't yield very good results, and so it wasn't really picked up again. I should mention here because I think it's important. So his book, Ergot Alkaloids, has just been published in English just last year, 2023, which is quite interesting to see that they're now sort of bringing out some of that research in the English language. I also want to just draw your attention to the image of the woman here with a gun. She's inoculating rye fields that they had moved into the Emmental Valley, a wetter region, to stimulate ergot production. This is during the Second World War, the beginnings of the Second World War, when food shortages are high. So this is quite a controversial move to take food supplies and turn them into pharmaceutical materials. Also, she wasn't paid. We don't know her name. She was a psychiatric patient who was, she and many others were brought into fields to do this. So that's got another story. But you may know the more part of the story where he actually had some LSD come onto his hand on April 16th. He felt some synesthesia. He felt disoriented. He wasn't sure what to do. He called his lab assistant, Susie Ramstein, who came and brought him home, brought him milk, tried to reverse the reactions that he was feeling. He was worried he'd driven himself permanently insane. And a few hours later, those feelings subsided, and he kind of relaxed into the moment and thought, he should try this again. So on April 19th, Albert Hofmann becomes the first man that we know of to have intentionally taken LSD. And some of you may celebrate or at least know about April 19th or Bicycle Day, which of course is, the anniversary of this historic moment. It also falls the day before 420, if you are into that. And this Bicycle Day has been memorialized in a variety of ways, including in multiple graphic novels, because Albert Hofmann allegedly hopped onto his bicycle after about an hour and felt that he'd been plunged into a Salvador Dali painting. He felt that his legs were moving, but the road was yawning and rippling before him, and he had these overwhelming synesthetic effects of, tasting color, for example. And again, he was accompanied by his faithful assistant, Susie Ramstein, who watched him, took notes, and it's due to her that we actually have some of this information. She then got married, changed her name, and has been lost to history, unfortunately. But wisely, and we believe she is the first woman to take LSD, she took public transit on her trip. Hofmann's discovery is really important, and Hofmann as a biochemist wasn't in a position to engage in trials or therapies or look at those kinds of applications, but Sandoz advertised this sort of remarkable, strange substance that they had encountered and encouraged researchers to apply for supplies, which they then freely provided. Now it happens that LSD sort of enters into the psi world, the psychology, the rise of neuroscience, the psychiatrists are all sort of grappling with different ideas about how to deal with what then seems to be a very kind of looming idea about a mental health crisis. And of course, we don't see that dissipating now. But it really comes at a time when psychopharmacology becomes the sort of the beginnings of the psychopharmacological paradigm, which I think a colleague here has coined. David Healy is the first to coin that phrase, as far as I know. So LSD enters into a space in time, or into a kind of intellectual culture, where a number of different disciplines are coming together to question the way that psychiatric disorders have been characterized, classified, and accommodated. That is, why are we putting people in long-stay custodial hospitals, asylums, expensive asylums that are overrun, and people are living the rest of their lives in these places with very little chance of rehabilitation? Most severe mental disorders throughout the Western world are treated through long-stay custodial support. Psychopharmacology and new developments in psychopharmacology in the 1950s seem to create an alternative model, and perhaps at least inspired people to think about the possibility of ameliorating symptoms such that people might be able to carry on meaningful lives in the community. So some people like Stanislav Grof, who himself went on to become a psychedelic researcher, argues that Hofmann's discovery of LSD deserves to be considered within this context of the kind of golden age of psychopharmacology. I'll let you read the quote there. And you may know, the first antipsychotic was introduced in 1952 in France. It was introduced in the United States in 1954. And a number of these antipsychotic medications, antihistamines, antidepressants are introduced in the 1950s, such that there were more psychopharmaceuticals introduced in that decade than ever before in human history or ever since, which is kind of hard to imagine. At the same time that there's a kind of flooding into the marketplace of these daily use psychopharmaceuticals, the American Psychiatric Association introduces their first classification system. There were other ones before that, but they really sort of amalgamate a number of different classification systems, and this is sort of the beginnings of the DSM emerging as what will become the sort of psychiatric Bible of classification. And of course, many scholars and critics have suggested that there's a relatively nefarious relationship between the classification system and the pharmaceutical solutions that are designed to accommodate them or ameliorate them. All right, so how does this get to Saskatchewan? So how many people have heard of Tommy Douglas? Okay, a few. So greatest Canadian. No, that's just a CBC poll. But Tommy Douglas was, of course, he's sort of known for introducing Medicare. So he's elected in 1944 as what is described as the first socialist government in North America at a provincial or state level. Douglas comes in and he is determined to introduce wide-ranging health reforms, publicly funded health reforms. And to do so, what he needs to do initially is not just, have a good idea about this and a good sort of plan for introducing publicly funded health care, but he needs good people, bureaucrats and researchers. And he starts to invest by producing state-funded or provincially funded grants to researchers who are willing to start thinking about solutions that are also going to meet their policy needs and kind of think about those healthcare economics, right? And in that context, he recruits Humphrey Osmond, the guy who's going to coin the word psychedelic here and whose head is exploding with flowers in this image. He recruits Humphrey Osmond to come, and after a year, and by 1952, he is the superintendent of the largest mental hospital in Western Canada. It is a hospital with 2,000 beds and 4,000 patients. They slept in shifts. It was not totally abnormal. Even what's the asylum called that was on the hill here, the Hamilton one? That one was also overcrowded. I can't remember. We did a whole project as grad students here about how many beds and how many people, but I forget. So Osmond comes in and he was already very interested in hallucinations. He'd been studying hallucinations during his time at the Maudsley Hospital, but he found that he wasn't really getting much traction there amongst his colleagues who he felt were very psychoanalytically oriented and who weren't really interested in psychotic disorders or the idea of psychosis at all. But what he wanted to do is try to understand if we pay attention to hallucinations and delusions or some of those positive features or pronounced features of schizophrenia, perhaps we can learn something about that kind of state of consciousness. But how can we do that, he wondered. And initially he thought that we could use substances like LSD, he also used mescaline, to try to have a glimpse into the mind of some of his patients. That is, to mimic mental illness or mimic psychosis such that one could perhaps then try to understand or even communicate with people undergoing psychotic expressions. And the image here of the woman in the pink shirt is Kay Parley, or it's meant to be Kay Parley, who is 102 years old. I'm going to have tea with her next week. She has written a book called Inside the Mental, where she talks about her role. She was first a patient diagnosed with schizophrenia. It went into remission. She became a psychiatric nurse, and against the doctor's orders, she took LSD because she wanted to know whether this organic experience of having experienced a psychosis in her life was the same or different from this LSD that people were talking about. In the book, she reconciles these two pieces or these two experiences and suggests that the LSD helped her to love herself. She knew that it would end, and it helped her to appreciate that there was something quite beautiful, quite wonderful about experiencing this kind of psychosis, and that she could love that part of herself and make herself whole. She's an amazing woman. I can't wait to see her. In 1953, Maclean's magazine sent a reporter out to Saskatchewan because they were like, what is going on out there with this kind of weird psychomimetic, psychosis, psycho stuff going on? And Sidney Katz sat in a room with a carpet that is not unlike that. This one's a little more three-dimensional. And he had a glass with 250 micrograms of LSD in it. And he described his experience, and they had an artist sitting with him who sort of sketched out what he was seeing. And they also had someone, a scribe, sort of writing down what he was saying. And this then ended up as a 9-page spread in Maclean's magazine that introduced a lot of Canadians to what was going on the Canadian prairies with respect to LSD research. And here he was very much sort of a bit of a guinea pig in some respects, but really trying to help to characterize that psychomimetic stage of the research. The idea that you could get a glimpse into madness, a glimpse into this kinds of disorder that seemed to be overwhelming patient populations all across the country, and in fact, really around the world. Well, I said set and setting. I should say something about set and setting. One of the things that they started to recognize very quickly was that it wasn't just a pharmacological reaction that people seemed to be commenting on, particularly as they asked people to comment about what was your experience like? What kinds of things did you see, or how did you feel or taste, that synesthetic quality. And the environment seemed to be very important. And they started to play around with different features of the environment to see whether they could optimize the experience, change the experience, maybe bring out different features of it. And I'm going to walk through a couple of examples of that. Not on the internet, as far as I know yet, unless this gets posted, and then it might make me a liar. There are a number of guidebooks, beginning, this one comes from 1952, there's one in 59, there's another one in 62 that I've seen in archives now, and I'm sure there are others, that are beginning to show how researchers are trying to make sense of the relationship between the environment and the pharmacological effects. What kinds of things should be in the environment? Can you standardize it? Does it need to be tailored? And they start to really carefully and strategically come up with different ways to frame or contain the experience in a clinical setting. So I'm not doing it outside yet. But things like, should you have natural light? Should you have a floor with patterns? And they would say no, because then it can sometimes sort of stimulate hallucinations, and you may feel like you don't want to step on a floor with patterns. Fluorescent lights would be bad. You want natural lighting. These sorts of things, they start commenting on this in over hundreds of cases. They begin to come up with a repository and a catalog of different ways to shape the room. Access to a washroom without having to walk by anyone is key, they say. And where's Max? Yes. So music comes into this too. Now, I can't help it. There's a funny story here. So you maybe have heard that some musicians like psychedelics, or that sometimes if you take a psychedelic and you listen to kinds of music, it can enhance your experience. There is a relationship here, but I think it's kind of fascinating that some of these mostly male doctors, psychiatrists and psychologists and a few social workers working on these early cases, they're not really trials, their wives were getting really bored, let's just say. And here they were, like it was -50 last week in Saskatchewan. These poor wives who were drawn in from Kansas and London and parts of California, they get together and they're listening to music and they're like, you know what if we brought music into these? So the wives whose names are not on any papers and who are not acknowledged in any other ways start to come into these experiments, partly because they're talking about this stuff all the time with their partners. And a number of women started influencing these sessions by talking this through with their husbands, over dinner or at dinner parties where there sometimes was LSD involved. And a few of these women were piano teachers or sort of amateur music therapists in their own right. And they start to think about this in a more robust way, not just, add a little bit of music here and there, but to start to think about, well, what would music do at the beginning? Would that help people to feel more calm? They will listen to something that's familiar, maybe calm them down, maybe distract them from the anxiety that they feel about what's going to happen. Will my arms turn into snakes like my friends did? And those sorts of things. These are paraphrased quotes from people I interviewed. And so music becomes part of this conversation, and in these two articles you can read a little bit more from Stephen Letts and from Zoe Dubus about how particular selections were made about music to draw out emotional responses, rather than use it as kind of elevator music, which was initially the idea. They even say elevator music, like music that's familiar but doesn't have lyrics, so you're not going to kind of start singing, but just kind of distracting, to music that makes you feel things. Like Mozart's Requiem, that like you listen to it and you don't know why you're crying. Music that elicits these kinds of emotional responses. And what if you choreograph that now with a 6 or 7 hour LSD trip? Would that help to get people engaging in an emotional way, in a more meaningful way that could be therapeutic? It might be quick, as in not spending your whole life in the hospital, but having a 8-hour session that gets you to engage with all sorts of emotional material. That's a cost-effective way of doing therapy in an environment where you're trying to introduce publicly funded healthcare. There are other influences too on the set and setting and on that kind of acoustic dynamic, or the set and setting that I'm elaborating on here. And I think a really important piece of that in the Canadian setting was a relationship that formed between researchers at Weyburn, Swift Current, Regina, places in Saskatchewan, and the Native American Church. There was one legally registered chapter of the Native American Church in Canada, and that was in Saskatchewan. It was registered in 1956, and it followed after a relatively public ceremony that took place just outside of North Battleford. It was hosted by the Red Pheasant First Nation and attended by, and you can see in the image here, William Russell, Frank Takes Gun, and Humphrey Osmond is sitting there sort of bent over. Now, there are a number of other people at the ceremony as well, but what happens in that ceremony is Osmond starts to write testimonials to the government saying, this is an honor ceremony, this is a sacred ceremony, it needs to be protected. It should not be wiped out, and there was a number of stories in the local newspapers suggesting that these were drunken sprees, these were orgies, these were terrible things, and we need to put some kind of lid on this. Osmond defends it and writes a number of testaments to the federal government, and they saved that particular ceremony. I should acknowledge that this is kind of a special thing. So the woman sitting here, I said I didn't need a pointer, and now I'll just use my arm. The woman sitting here, there's only one woman in that picture. I don't have her name. Her grandson, Kelly Daniels, is the man standing here between myself and my postdoc, James Dixon. And he invited us to come to a peyote ceremony, and I was very nervous, and I didn't know what was going to happen for many, many reasons. And I brought all the records I could find about the peyote ceremony that I'd studied from 1956. So I went and I spent the whole day with him before the ceremony, and we poured through these photographs and poured through the archival records, and he identified all of the people sitting in that ceremony who had not been named in the newspaper. He identified all of these people, explained who the roadman was, explained that Humphrey Osmond had written to get his uncle out of jail. His uncle was held at the border when he had gone on the peyote pilgrimage, and that every year they honor this collaboration between those researchers who came to them and the researchers who helped them to protect their ceremony. And so they did an honor ceremony, and I was so privileged to be able to witness that and participate in it. And we're continuing to work together, and we hope to write something about this. But the descendants of, so the grandchildren of this group gathered last August. One of the things I want to just quickly mention, though, is it wasn't just there was a legal piece to this that's really important, you know, getting the registered charity. But the other thing was it helped the researchers to recognize a different kind of setting, a circular setting, a setting that had very ritualistic components that really kind of embedded a deference to the substance into the very setting itself. And they began to work with the Native American Church in order to try to understand how you might introduce group therapy principles in a way that mirrored some of the principles or features of the Native American Church ceremony. And I think there's some really fascinating collaborations that are sort of starting to emerge at this time, but before the genie gets out of the bottle, there are a number of scientific reasons why psychedelics are coming under some pressure. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, psychopharmacology is going to save our lives, you know, it's going to help reform mental health, and there's a lot of interest in better living with chemistry, as the DuPonts would have you believe. But there were also a number of problems emerging on the horizon. And by the early 1960s, there were a number of sort of chemical crises that had grabbed the headlines of newspapers and shook the public confidence in our capacity as researchers to determine the safety profiles of a number of chemicals, whether it's thalidomide, Distaval, whether we're talking about poisoning our oceans or putting lead in our paint. There are a number of these stories that begin to really question how do we safely assess these substances that we are ingesting or putting on our walls or into our food. And here's where we begin to see psychedelic researchers engaging with questions about methodology, specifically around clinical trials. Now, prior to this, they're mostly doing case reports, and they write up beautiful case reports, and everybody has a nice time, or some of them don't have a nice time, but they talk about it anyway. But by 1962, following the thalidomide scandal, which kind of plays its way out in Canada, was never approved in the United States, psychedelic researchers are being asked to study the effects of psychedelics using controlled trials and later randomized controlled trials. And people like Hoffer, who was in Saskatoon, and Osmond write back against this and say, you know, we've spent a lot of time creating this set and setting and really trying to theorize about that relationship, and this is not conducive to optimizing those therapeutic benefits. It's actually isolating a pharmacological effect that is not beneficial to our patients. By this time, they're using it to treat alcoholism, I should mention. And a number of people start sort of questioning whether psychedelics can effectively be studied in a controlled environment, or a controlled trial environment, I should say. It also starts to beg the question as to whether or not researchers should have their own experiences with psychedelics, like these guys felt that they should in order to study psychosis, or whether that would compromise the integrity of the methods used to evaluate objectively the outcome of that pharmacological research. You can read about the trials of psychedelic therapy in Matthew Oram's book. He does a really lovely analysis of what's going on in the United States. Researchers found, though, that in addition to these questions from their colleagues and their peers at their psychiatric associations or psychological associations, also something weird was happening. Like, students were coming to them with their own music. They wanted good Sandoz LSD or something like that. Like, uh-oh, the genie's getting out of the bottle. Students seem to be using psychedelic cases or trials as a safe place for having an experience, already with expectations about what psychedelics might do. And they were really pissed off if they got Benadryl. You know, they came for rainbows or whatever. Researchers started folding up some of their labs at this time, suggesting that they weren't able to get good results. They couldn't do good science because they no longer had naive subjects that they were working with in terms of naive drug use. They were worried about getting funding, and funding agencies were beginning to pull back from the psychedelic research. All right. I want to just suggest for context as well that it's not just other psychiatrists or psychologists or pharmacologists who are beginning to be a bit skeptical about the claims of psychedelic research. There are a number of others who also say, like, hang on, you know, we've been studying consciousness for a long time in other ways. Parapsychologists like Eileen Garrett have been investing in parapsychology and really leading a lot of the conversations around psychic phenomena. And there were relationships. She said, you know, you need to think about parapsychology as you begin to think about consciousness states too. Don't just go to like academics and institutions who think about theories of consciousness. You need to kind of get outside of that frame in order to fully appreciate how we can study consciousness. And you can see her here. It's not an excellent picture, but Humphrey Osmond took this picture, and they've got, like, you know, okay, maybe David, you know that there used to be a time when you had to take a picture, and then it might be months before you know what you took a picture of. So this is the only picture we have because it probably sat on a film roll for a while. But Eileen Garrett meeting with Albert Hofmann, and she tried to convince him that psychedelics and parapsychologists should start talking to each other. And of course, if you didn't know before, Michel Foucault also, you know, a critic of biomedicine and psychiatry and power and lots of things, also felt that LSD had helped to change his life when he took it in California. So some of these people who already had amassed a kind of social capital or cultural capital as critics of biomedicine are also aligning with psychedelics at a time when psychedelic researchers are, in some respects, struggling to find their place as credible researchers within the biomedical field. Then there's this guy. Timothy Leary was a Harvard-trained psychologist who in 1963 was fired from Harvard. Now, depending on which book you read, you can choose your own adventure here as to which story you believe to be true. Did he get fired because he was giving psilocybin mushrooms to his students? It's true. Did he get fired for it? Did he get fired because he was sleeping with his students? Also true. Did he get fired for it? Or did he get fired because he didn't show up to class? I've got a magnet for anyone who gets the right answer, or for the first person who gets the right answer. Not showing up to class. You already got a magnet. Officially, he gets fired for not showing up to class, but it is true that these other things were happening as well. So Timothy Leary, rather than, go away quietly as, a good faculty member would do, no. He runs right to the media and becomes a self-appointed apostle of a psychedelic moment and a psychedelic revolution. Gone are the, clinical controlled trials or the research ethics. Now he's suggesting that we should put psychedelics in the water supplies, that we could end the Cold War by, flying over Russia with psychedelic sprays, or, really crazy stuff, some of which I don't think is even true that he said. And of course, he becomes known as this guy who says, turn on, tune in, drop out, which allegedly he learned from Marshall McLuhan, but I just like CanCon when I can. Leary, I think, is part of a tipping point, and I don't think he actually is to blame for this change, but I think things are bubbling up. The research model is on a bit shaky ground, but there's also a kind of revolutionary cultural expression of psychedelics or embrace of psychedelics that is beginning to change the script, particularly in the media. So the first edition of High Times magazine comes out publishing this rather provocative look at a woman probably about to eat a mushroom. Jimi Hendrix, of course, explodes onto stage with his electric guitar based on a photograph taken by Linda Eastman, who becomes Linda McCartney. Tall Paul, the fellow in the white turtleneck there, becomes famous for this iconic image of student protesters for Vietnam War protests and protesting the draft. Tall Paul, his friends tell me, went on to become one of the largest underground acid dealers in the Bay Area. And acid or psychedelics forge this association with a kind of countercultural critique of certainly American foreign policy, but also with the kind of status quo or conservative status quo. And that alignment of psychedelics with something radical, countercultural, really, I think, starts to dominate the local press. By the end of the decade of the 1960s, so in 1970, Richard Nixon has had enough of this, his war is going badly as well, and he's got to blame somebody. So he introduces this war on drugs. He allegedly claims, we can't find this information to verify it, but he allegedly claims that Timothy Leary is the most dangerous man in America. Timothy Leary, of course, at this point gets arrested, and the Weather Underground and the Black Panther Party flee him to Algeria, where people are still siphoning drugs to him. But there's all sorts of stuff going on that is really sort of creating this fever pitch of concern about the place of psychedelics in this modern world. Public health, the NIH in the United States puts out these public health films about LSD, insanity, or insight. It's kind of hilarious because it's like Sonny Bono is the voiceover on this, and like now he probably would not be the voice of the narc, but anyway. So anyway, Richard Nixon says, all of these drugs are criminalized, they have no medical benefits, and they are highly addictive. Researchers disagree, but that doesn't matter. It falls on deaf ears. A year later, the Convention on Psychotropic Substances is convened by the United Nations, and they bring together all sorts of member states to sign an agreement suggesting that psychedelics are of no medicinal value, and they cut funding across the board. There are some research units that remain open, but the funding dries up enormously, and researchers can no longer maintain their kind of credibility studying psychedelics. And now, for some historians, myself included, in that first book, this is sort of where the story ends. Now we can't find stuff in the library. Now we can't, there's a few stories that come out. We later learn that, the CIA was funding stuff and there's been some mind control experiments. But really, the stories about psychedelics dry up for a number of decades. But it's not really the way the story goes. There's a whole story of psychedelics that continues and persists. It just doesn't make its way into university libraries or into archives or into public records in the same way. It gets buried in basements and in memories and in ways that people have talked about psychedelics in the intervening years between the war on drugs in 1970 and, let's say, 2007, I'll say at random. Blotter acid, the Grateful Dead, concert posters, and all sorts of underground expressions of psychedelics continue to proliferate in this period and move around the world in different ways. Desktop publishing becomes cheaper and more accessible for a number of people who don't seem to want to use their real names, or maybe their Christian name is Mary Jane Superweed. a number of these kinds of underground magazines circulate in different areas. These are from collected by a friend of mine in San Francisco who may have contributed to some. And there are a number of mail-away catalogs, cultivation guides, how to make your own DMT, how to take the right amount of ecstasy and which rave you should go to, how much water you should drink at a rave, all sorts of things that we might associate with harm reduction, but also procurement and protocols for how to gain access to psychedelics during a criminalized period. Now, some people are more brazen, people like Sasha Shulgin and Anne Shulgin, Sasha, of course, a chemist, and Anne, his wife, psychologist. They openly publish books that are essentially, in some respects, a recipe book and a guide to how to take your favorite psychedelic. And Sasha Shulgin is notorious for probably introducing over 200 psychoactive compounds into the psychedelic underground. They become honorary godfather, mother, godparents of Burning Man. They are beloved figures who continued until their dying days to hold dinner parties of, upwards of 70 people where they would talk about psychedelics and get really excited about the chemistry behind them. And what Sasha Shulgin has articulated is the need for chemistry to not be patented, the need for us to understand and know what kinds of substances we're getting into. He said, people are going to take them anyway. Let's know what they are. Let's know how they work. Mark McLeod, who owns Blotter Barn, has shared many pieces of blotter art with me. I think he came for the art and he stayed for the acid. That's his quote to me. There's a whole history of blotter art and blotter artists, both chemists and artists, and sometimes one and the same, who see themselves as chemical artists. People like Owsley Stanley, who was not only the sound man for the Grateful Dead, but also a notorious underground acid dealer, and a whole variety of other people whose names are lost to history because some of them are still on extradition charges, and some of them we don't know where they are, and some of them, well, we don't know if they ever used their real names. This is part of that history, and part of what I think is something that we should think about in terms of the kinds of cultural expertise that still exists. And we know that by looking outside of our North American, I'll say Canada and the United States borders, to include Mexico in that, there are also a number of different places that have collected, sometimes underground and sometimes above ground, information about sort of travelers through the hippie trail, researchers in Czechia, or what was Czechoslovakia at the time, who continued to do LSD research well into the 1980s, or the kinds of alignments with British public health on introducing pamphlets like, okay, people are taking ecstasy anyway, how do we promote harm reduction? There's some of these materials do exist for us to begin to evaluate. All right, so I want to come to a conclusion then. So, is anybody at Psychedelic Science? Did anybody attend? Oh man, I was the only one there, so now you have to take my word for it. It was a zoo. There were 13,000 people, a Republican senator, NHL superstar Aaron Rodgers. I mean, there were some people wearing clothes and some people not, and there were a lot of feathers. It was a little bit wild. I don't know if it was an academic conference, although I did manage to find some academic friends. But Psychedelic Science has come back online now with a vengeance. Now we are bringing together, 13,000 people in Denver, where the mayor, welcomed everyone and handed out mushrooms. He didn't hand out mushrooms, but he did not discourage us from looking for them, paying for them in his nice town. People are claiming that the psychedelic renaissance is ready to sort of revisit some of this past, but also to try to avoid some of the pitfalls or mistakes from the past. And obviously, you are all here. You've probably come across many of these things already. There are clinical hopes like Stephen Ross here suggesting that, psychedelics are very valuable in end-of-life anxiety or managing end-of-life anxiety. And there are others like Mike Tyson, who maybe wasn't peer-reviewed before he said, I died while tripping on bufo after smoking the venom of a toad. There are a number of people who are moving into this space, some of whom have a lot of cultural capital, but are not necessarily vetted or held accountable by the kinds of institutional logic that we have, that most of us here at the universities are required to do. They don't have to get research ethics. They don't even necessarily have to go through any ethics boards. And philanthropists are funding a lot of this movement that are tied to very different mechanisms and different sorts of accountability than, say, CIHR. Meanwhile, academic researchers, or I'll say, peer-reviewed researchers, researchers who have to subscribe to a particular methodology and have some accountability, are nonetheless making some pretty tremendous claims in terms, like the FDA has recognized, breakthrough status, at least in these two categories. Health Canada has very tepidly made some allowances. There were, I don't know if you know the number. Last I checked, it was 173 people have been approved through Section 56 exemptions for psilocybin for end-of-life anxiety, 1 for major depression. And of course, with the special access programs now, a number of clinics, mostly ketamine clinics, are able to apply for running trials and beginning to slowly and with a lot of red tape move psychedelics into approvals from Health Canada. And I won't go off on all these details because I feel like as soon as I make a slide, it's outdated. Like these things are happening very quickly. Although my sort of summary of this is that although there have been some quite bold claims from Health Canada, Justice Canada, and from some provinces, I think there's quite a lot of red tape still, and we're not quite there in terms of opening up the psychedelic moment. Anyway, Alberta has been trying to claim this, but I don't think they're actually going very far. There are also institutions that are beginning to invest in psychedelic research chairs, and this would have been unheard of when I was doing my PhD research here in the early 2000s. That was laughable. But now we have real bona fide universities like Johns Hopkins or Berkeley or Calgary, I guess, Queen's University, that have psychedelic research chairs with a combination of provincial or federal money, sometimes with some private money as well, but places that are held accountable to these kinds of research ethics and standards that are now beginning to give some credibility and gravitas to these research questions. But still, I think we're competing with some of these other testimonials and the kind of celebrity hype that is coming around psychedelics. Aaron Rodgers is a better person, maybe a better quarterback because of his ayahuasca journeys. Mark Messier because I love Canada, and the Oilers. I mean, come on. They are on such a winning streak. Mike Tyson. Okay, so athletes with a different kind of social capital than most of us, right? Maybe all of us. Engineers. All right, so here's how I want to end. So I think, and thank you for listening, by the way, I think that there's something that we can take from this history, not only in appreciating how that history changes as new sources become available, they're old sources, but as people become more confident or comfortable sharing stories about psychedelics that have long been hidden. And this is just an example by looking over the last 70 years. Of course, this can extend back in different regions in various different ways. But one of the things we know for sure is that people have figured out how to make psychedelics. People have have continued to share those recipes and share those stories, and people can find this online. They can find it if you know the right people. This is not something that Health Canada or the FDA or the United Nations can necessarily put a lid on. So how do we manage that fact? Secondly, is this an opportunity, if we take psychedelics very seriously, not as a pharmacological agent, but even as something that we might invest intellectual energy in? What do psychedelics represent to us as a historical moment? Does this give us another opportunity to reinvest in reconciliation practices by thinking about the way that Indigenous communities, and there's not one, the various ways that diverse Indigenous communities have engaged in healing practices that embed spirituality at the heart of those practices? How do we think about ceremony? How do we think about some of these other features that are deep and rich within those Indigenous cultures that aren't and haven't been part of biomedicine for a long time? And finally, will academic institutions lead the psychedelic revolution, or will they exhaust it or sort of choke it out? I'm not yet convinced, in my 20 years as a faculty member, that academic institutions are nimble. We're as old as the Catholic Church, right? We're not known for flexibility, and that is both a strength and a challenge. If the psychedelic revolution continues to be funded by philanthropic celebrities and whatnot, I think that there's a very different set of capital and a very different set of rules associated with the checks and balances on the kind of information that comes out about psychedelics. Now, we can't control that. People are still going to go to Reddit to find out, what doses they want to take based on their Reddit community or their Facebook community. But academic institutions nonetheless have a responsibility to play in training our nurses and social workers and doctors and even historians about how we talk about this, how we educate each other about this, and how we manage the way that people are going to take psychedelics, whether Health Canada approves or not, or any other FDA agency. So I just want to end by suggesting that I really think that this is an exciting moment, and despite my somewhat flippant comments about the feathers and glitter at psychedelic science, one of the things that is exciting about those meetings, well, that's obviously very exciting, but one of the other things that is exciting is that psychedelics have not yet landed in a particular discipline. It's not clear that this is a problem for psychiatrists to figure out. We need religious studies, we need humanities, we need psychology, we need psychiatry, we need a whole variety of different disciplines to come together to really think about the effects that psychedelics might have going forward and how we sustain this rather than continuing to either cleave them off into a criminal category, people take them anyway, or make them completely open and then we have to deal with all the consequences because we haven't thought that through. That is not a project that the political science department is ready to handle on its own. I think we need diversity not only within the institutions, but from thinking around the world about how different psychedelic projects have taken root. Thanks. Thanks, Max. Rotem.
Thanks for the talk. Amazing stuff. I'm so happy and excited. This is a lot of new stuff for me, so thank you for sharing all of this. I have many questions, but there's also many people here, so I'll start with just one. I'm so curious. I really thought that it was well documented that Nixon coined that dangerous, most dangerous man in America. Where's the apocryphal coming from?
It's so interesting you say that because I've been talking with Leary's archivist, and he's like, I don't think they actually said that. And then a bunch of us have been like trying to figure it out, and it gets repeated and repeated and repeated such that it becomes true. But then we're like, well, it actually, and Leary wasn't shy about also claiming it, right? Like, of course, like he loved that. But we can't actually find documented evidence. So that's why I'm skirting around that, saying it's alleged because I don't want to be, they're like, Erika said it. I'm like, I don't know if it's true. Anyway, it's part of the hype. Yeah.
Thank you. All of this work you've done around the history in regards to like the modern use, and then giving acknowledgement, of course, to it being used indigenously. But in indigenous ceremony, of course, it's not used necessarily to heal. It's not for a diagnosis referring to a DSM or specific to anybody who has experienced PTSD or depression. It's actually for everybody. And whereas research appears to be looking more at people with a diagnosis and trying to frame it with a DSM. So I'm wondering, with your big picture lens, your thoughts of the future of psychedelics as something not necessarily for medicine and treating, but maybe more through the indigenous lens of holistic awareness for everybody.
I thank you for that question. I very much agree, and I don't see that happening at the conversations that, with regulators, whether it's Health Canada or even at provinces, or even talking about clinical trials. There seem to be very different conversations. And the limited, albeit, conversations I've had with Indigenous communities who are openly talking about their own, they would say medicine use, but they're using sacred plants that have psychedelic effects. They talk about it very differently, and they have not been invited to some of these questions. And some of that's, like, it seems like apples and chimpanzees. They're talking about such different things that it's difficult to find that common ground. I do think, this is my like pie in the sky historical intervention, but I do think that that's a challenge we should work on. That the vocabulary, the way that we even understand suffering and trauma, or even spirituality, transitions, some of the language and the sort of characterization of why some Indigenous communities, and there's lots of different ones obviously, why they reach for psychedelics are very different from, like, they don't fit in a DSM category at all. And even to use that is like almost laughable, right? Because they're not thinking about it in the same way. But I think there's a lot to be learned in a reciprocal way from talking to one another and really deeply listening, not token listening. And unfortunately, I think that sometimes there's a kind of sense that there's, like, we're in a hot moment in a psychedelic gold rush, and we need to figure this out right now. It's like, we might need to go slow. And some of the unpacking of, what does distress mean might need to go slowly. We might have to listen to I think we have to listen to diverse voices, so thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Erika.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation.
Thanks.
It's great to meet you today. So I'm also wondering, on the indigenous side, like, because psychedelics have gained so much hype, like,
Mhm.
People are paying special attention to Indigenous ceremonies, especially those involving psychoactive substances. How do you feel like is the best way to manage that sort of commodification that's going on?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of psychedelic tourism, right? And whether we're talking about, if we're talking about Canadian Indigenous communities, I don't think that's necessarily happening here as much, and those communities are quite quiet right now, as far as I understand. There are a lot of other problems that they're facing and dealing with, and that's one of the comments that's come back to me in this research as well, is like, please don't tell anybody where we are. Like, we don't need people coming and, you know, thinking they're gonna like break into our peyote supplies or something. Like, we're dealing with complex problems in our communities, and actually, like, if the federal government learns about us, we'd like it to be for like how they're gonna fix our water supplies, or, you know, fixing the housing crisis, or this isn't, and it very much fits into the sort of that worldview as well, that this isn't a story about peyote, this is a story about community and kinship. And peyote is part of many, many things, and a relationship to nature, and a relationship to one another and to ancestors. And I think in the Canadian context, this is a very different conversation. When we start thinking about the psychedelic tourism, some communities are embracing it, right? So we have Shipibo communities in Peru, for example, that are encouraging people to come in. And this is a good source of revenue, but it also has downstream effects. And it also means that, like, you got to pay for yourself to get to Peru. And maybe you should go for more than a weekend and see how people actually live. You know, like, there are all sorts of ethical and moral questions that we are confronted with. And if we are privileged and can just do that and don't have to apply for research ethics or even tell anyone you did it, or maybe you want to tell your friends later, you know, you have that kind of power to know how you're going to engage. Whereas a lot of the communities that are providing this medicine don't necessarily have that power. And if the tourism dries up, they actually are in a bad way. We've seen that in the case of a number of Guatemalan communities that shifted from producing coffee, which was a fairly stable, though labor-intensive crop, to providing psilocybin ceremonies. And during COVID, there were no tourists coming for psilocybin, and communities were in desperate states, trying to make some money. So I think it's really complicated. I don't think there's like we should all go to this one, or this one's approved. Like, there isn't really a board approving, like, these are certified good ayahuasca places or psilocybin places. So I think it is a bit of a kind of wild moment. There's a lot of uncertainty, and I think, well, there are some organizations that are investing in reciprocity initiatives. To me, that seems like a good place to start, but I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done even on determining what becomes reciprocal, particularly when talking about very different contexts. It's not just a capital transaction that makes it reciprocal. That's not really an answer, sorry. Rambled thoughts. Yeah, David?
I have a question about the blotter art.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I can go back to it if you want.
you know, all the different individuals that are making the blotter art, is it still just LSD 25 that they're putting on the blotter, or do they actually have different psychoactive ingredients that are on different blotters?
Oh, that's a Mark McLeod question. He is a fascinating individual to sit down and talk to. Well, the answer is I don't know, is the true answer, but little bits. There's a new book coming out by Erika Dyck called Blotter, like a history of art or something like that. He'll probably answer your question. But what Mark McLeod explained to me, we put together this collage in part because we wanted squares so I could make it into a collage. But, you know, like, some of them are like Owsley Stanley's, and he was known for, none of these are Sandoz, right? So technically they're not LSD 25. But this one from somebody who is now in jail was known for this gold samurai acid. And they don't think it's not LSD 25, but it was like creme de la creme of, you know, acid experiences. So these are really, really rare. And it's exciting that he has a piece of it. But he did say that there are, so this one comes from the Brotherhood. I don't know the answer to all of these. When he knows provenance of it, it's all on his website, and he makes it all open access. You can't buy acid from him that I know of, or I'm supposed to tell you that. But you can look at these online. Don't lick your screen. When he knows about some of the, you know, the artists involved, they're almost never named, and I suspect that's because they don't want to be. But he does give a little description of them. So some of these he knows very little about, and some of them there's a little bit more. Not a thick description in any case. But he'll say, like, this was around, we know, since the 1970s. And some of them, there's ones like celebrating, like, World Cup 2004. You know, it's like, those are newer. So yeah, we tried to get a little bit of a variety here. And also he told me, he's like, I'm not going to tell you why, but there's some here that for personal reasons I want you to include. So I'm like, talk to Mark. But yes, they all have their kind of their own stories, and some of these are actually all the same designer. And I don't know exactly which ones, because again, he's like, I can't tell you everything. So, any other questions? Yeah? Yeah, you can go if nobody else. Otherwise, I'm going to say no.
Another question I had is about the Timothy Leary effect, now Michael Pollan effect.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, so from my perspective as a quantitative researcher, I'm like, well, what do we do with that? Well, we ask people what they think, we try and quantify their opinions, and then we try and control for that in statistical ways.
Yeah.
This is a very, I don't know what I'm going to call it myopic, but this is a very kind of narrow way of addressing this issue. I'm very curious from your perspective, as someone who thinks broadly, what do you think would be a good way to engage with that?
Yeah, I've really struggled with this one because, part of me thinks, the more I study this, the less I feel like I'm actually cool, right? Like, Michael Pollan should be quiet, and you guys should be quiet. Everyone should just calm down. I'm like, wow, I'm really the mom in this. Like, I am totally mumming this moment, and I sound very conservative, and I didn't think I was. But it does seem sometimes that, there's a bit of a feedback loop where people say something about psychedelics, and often today, again, very different from even 10 years ago, let alone 20 or 30 years ago, like self-disclosure of like, I had LSD and it made me feel this way, or, died from your bufa experience. Those kinds of testimonials have really been gathering a lot of capital and a lot of power. I mean, people are excited to read about that and share it on social media, and this becomes a really powerful narrative that I think is really dangerous, particularly for those of us trying to do sober research, if you will. Because what happens now if somebody doesn't die and feel better? Like, does that mean they're really sick? Or something's really wrong with them? And I think some of that feedback is not getting carried forward with the kind of like celebrity testimonials. And that's going to fall on whether, again, it's Health Canada or McMaster Psychedelic Society or whoever, whoever's going to solve the problem of like, okay, so psychedelics aren't going to work for everybody, or whatever working is, right? Because working could be like living. It could be microdosing to just have a better life. It could be enhancement, but it could also help to address some more complicated issues. But if it doesn't work for somebody, or if somebody does have a bad experience, then what? And I think that narrative is not really capturing the complexity, and instead it's, clickbait, it's, big headlines that are contributing to a hype that I don't think we can really sustain or accommodate. I don't think we can manage that. So I think it's really dangerous. How to stop it? I don't know. Like, we invited Michael Pollan to a conference, and then he said, sure, I'll come for $50,000. So we stopped it by saying, sorry, we don't have $50,000 to pay you to give a talk that you've already written about, that we already know what you're going to say. So anyway, I don't know. Do we stop buying his books? I mean, it's also important to get these conversations out there. So I don't know how to manage that, but.
Just sounds like maybe we need new narratives, new stories that are like, well, if it didn't work for you, or if it only, like we need to talk to be like, this was fine.
Yeah, like, I did mushrooms and, it was okay. Like, whoa, but that's not going to get on the press, right? That's like 6th page or, buried, or like you and I talk about that over, a cup of coffee, and then we don't even talk about it because there's nothing to say. It's hard to sort of make that kind of stuff exciting, and I think that's one of the things we face as academics is like sometimes the results are just not that sensational, but they're really important, and it's important to ground that or embed it in that complicated context. So I don't know how to do that. But there are exciting things too. Like, we also want to talk about those.
So I'll remind everybody there's a reception that's going to happen in the faculty lounge on the 2nd floor, start in about 10 minutes or so. And if everybody can just give Erika a nice round of applause.
Thank you.